Welcome to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring the random prompts of Daniel Rosehill as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters. Join us for deep dives into AI, technology, and whatever other random thing Daniel finds fascinating today. Subscribe on Spotify or your favorite podcatcher. Now, today's episode.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hi Herman and Corin. So we had some funner episodes today talking about neurodivergence. Got us away from the uranium theme for a little bit, but my wife walked in the door and she actually really got a lot of value out of that episode where we talked about the real consequences or potential consequences of an Iranian nuclear attack. And I think that was probably the most challenging episode we've produced to date. And I reiterate that it should come with a strong listener disclaimer. If people would be distressed by the content, then don't listen to it, because stress, as we point out so many times, is not a useful emotion in preparedness. But for those who are happy wading into that episode, it painted a grisly but realistic depiction of what that would actually mean. And I guess why it's so imperative that Iran is not allowed to pass that point of that really dangerous pivot point. And that's where we have to kind of get a little bit technical, and why I wanted to dedicate another episode exclusively, not just to the concept of breakout, as we talked about before. And the analogy I use for breakout that came to my mind was that it's like a pizzeria where you have tomatoes, everything's lined up, it's on our production line. You have the nuclear material, you have the launchers, you have the hypersonic missiles, and you just need to quickly assemble them and get them out, God forbid. But the key ingredient over which there is so much uncertainty in the question is the actual nuclear material, because that can't just be at 60%, it has to get to 90%. And you mentioned in that episode that the reason why we're seeing so much frenzied activity at the moment is because, and why the breakout period is called that, is that it's not that to get from 0 to 90% is an equal continuum. The last leg, 60 to 90, can happen relatively quickly. And what I'd love to delve into in this podcast is maybe the $1 million question, although I hate to reuse that turn of phrase that we seem to keep falling back upon. But it's in a context in which Iran is not being transparent in any way about its nuclear program. It's not cooperating with the IAEA, and we're counting on the world's intelligence community, or the parts of it that are allied in this belief, to assess exactly what the current capability is, and when that pivot point happens, to determine the latest point at which decisive military action might be necessary. And we've heard different estimates, but the commonality between them being that we're talking about days or weeks or maybe even months, but it's not like a next quarter they might get there, or we think the next year, based on where we think they are now, we could get there. And of course, when we're talking about nuclear weapons, there's no margin for error here. So my question, Herman and Corin, and this is maybe one of the most challenging ones that I've thrown your way, because I do so knowing that the answer is really challenging for anyone to know, outside of probably a very, very small group of people at the head of the CIA, Mossad, and the leaders they brief. But if we can get any thinking as to how that process might be going on, how does the world in this context try to estimate exactly what the real capabilities of Iran are? And let's go back to that breakout window period and try to think about it in the actual breakdown within the breakout. In other words, when Iran might be really nearing the end of that window, the cusp of it, which maybe is 80 to 90%. What are the signs that the world is watching out for to know when we're getting really close to that danger window? Herman and Corin, sorry, we're back to nuclear Iran, but it's an important topic that we need to keep delving into in today's episode of My Word Prompts.
Hey everyone, welcome back to My Weird Prompts. I am Korn, and I am sitting here in our Jerusalem home with my brother. It is February 24th, 2026, and the air outside feels a bit heavier than usual.
Herman Poppleberry here. We are diving back into some incredibly heavy territory today. The headlines over the last few months have been dominated by the escalating situation with Iran's nuclear program, and frankly, it feels like we are reaching a definitive crossroads.
Yeah, Daniel's prompt today brings us right to the heart of the Iranian nuclear issue, which we have touched on before, but never in this much technical detail. Specifically, Daniel wants us to look at how the international community actually estimates Iran's real capabilities. How do they determine when that famous breakout window is finally closing?
It is the million-dollar question, or maybe the trillion-dollar question given the global security stakes. We talk about the breakout window all the time in the news, but the technical reality of what that means, and how you measure it when the country in question is actively trying to hide its progress, is incredibly complex. It is a mix of high-level physics, satellite surveillance, and old-school spycraft.
Right. And it is not just a guess. There is a whole architecture of intelligence and nuclear engineering behind these estimates. Daniel mentioned that last leg of the journey, the jump from 60% enrichment to 90%, which is weapons grade. To a layperson, that sounds like you are only 2/3 of the way there. If you have 60%, you need 30% more to hit 90. But we know the physics says otherwise.
Exactly. It is highly nonlinear. But before we get into the math of enrichment, we should probably define what the intelligence community is actually looking at in 2026. When we say breakout, we are usually talking about the time it would take to produce enough weapons-grade uranium for a single nuclear explosive device. That is roughly 25 kilograms of uranium enriched to 90%. Right now, most estimates put that breakout time at a matter of days, maybe even just a few days.
Which is a massive, terrifying shift from where things were just a few years ago. I remember when we were talking about months or even a year under the old nuclear deal. So, let's start with the transparency issue. If Iran is not fully cooperating with the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, and they have restricted inspector access to several key sites, how do we even have a baseline for these estimates?
Well, we do still have some eyes on the ground, though they are blinking. The IAEA still has some cameras and some remote monitoring systems in place, though their ability to verify the continuity of knowledge has been severely curtailed since 2021. But the intelligence community, specifically the United States, Israel, and the E3, which is France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, they rely on what we call a multi-int approach. That is, human intelligence, signals intelligence, imagery intelligence, and even measurement and signature intelligence.
So, it is not just waiting for an official report from Vienna. They are looking at satellite imagery of facilities like Natanz and Fordo every single day. What are they looking for specifically in those images that tells them the status of the centrifuges?
They are looking for activity patterns. If you see an increase in specialized truck traffic or changes in the thermal signatures coming from the cooling systems of these underground facilities, that tells a story. Centrifuges generate heat. Thousands of centrifuges spinning at supersonic speeds generate a lot of heat. Power consumption in these areas is another big one. If you see a spike in the electrical load going into a mountain where we know cascades are located, you can start to calculate how many machines are likely active.
That makes sense, but the prompt specifically asked about the pivot point, that jump from 60 to 90%. If they are already at 60%, which Iran has openly admitted to and achieved in significant quantities, why is that last jump so critical, and how do we spot it before it is finished?
This is where the physics gets really interesting and, frankly, scary. To get from natural uranium, which is about 0.7% uranium-235, to 5%, which is what you need for a standard power plant, you have to do the vast majority of the work. You are stripping away a huge amount of uranium-238. By the time you get to 60% enrichment, you have already completed about 95% of the total effort required to reach weapons grade at 90%.
That is the part that always trips people up. It is like a funnel. The first part of the process is huge and slow because you are dealing with massive volumes of material. But as you get toward the bottom of the funnel, the volume is smaller and the concentration is higher, so it moves much, much faster.
Exactly. Think of it like a massive industrial refinery where the product gets more concentrated at every stage. When you are at 60%, the material is so highly enriched already that you only need a very small number of centrifuge stages to push it over the finish line to 90%. This is what we call the tail end of the enrichment S-curve. The intelligence community is watching for a reconfiguration of the cascades to handle this final rapid pass.
Explain that for us. What does reconfiguring a cascade actually look like from a surveillance perspective?
Okay, so centrifuges are arranged in groups called cascades. They are connected by a complex web of pipes and valves. To get to higher enrichment levels, you usually need to link these cascades in a specific series. If inspectors or satellite sensors detect that the piping is being changed, or if they see what we call batch enrichment, where they take a finished batch of 60% and feed it back into the top of a cascade that was previously doing lower level work, that is the red alert. That process of reconfiguration and the final enrichment run can happen in a matter of days.
So, the jump from 60 to 90% is not a new industrial process. It is just a final pass through the machines they already have.
Precisely. And because the volume of material is so much smaller at 60%, you do not need as many machines to do it. This creates the hidden facility problem that keeps intelligence analysts up at night. You could potentially take a small amount of 60% material to a small hidden facility that has not been declared to the IAEA. Because you do not need thousands of centrifuges to finish the job at that stage, a secret site could be much smaller and easier to hide.
How do you find a site like that? If it is small and buried, are we just guessing?
Not entirely. Analysts are constantly searching for signatures of secret enrichment sites. They look for traces of uranium hexafluoride gas in the atmosphere using specialized sensors. They look for the procurement of specialized materials being diverted from the known supply chain, things like high-strength aluminum or carbon fiber for centrifuge rotors. If Iran is buying more of these materials than their declared program requires, the question is, where is the rest going?
Let's talk about the human element. You mentioned human intelligence earlier. We know from history, like the famous Mossad raid on the Iranian nuclear archive back in 2018, that there is a massive amount of paperwork and digital data involved in a weapons program.
Right. You cannot build a functional nuclear weapon with just gas. You need weaponization. You need to turn that uranium hexafluoride gas into a solid metal sphere. You need a high explosive trigger system that can compress that sphere perfectly symmetrically. And you need to miniaturize the whole package to fit on the tip of a ballistic missile. The intelligence community is watching for activity at military sites like Parchin or Sanjarian, where they have done high explosive testing in the past.
And that is a different timeline than the enrichment, right? You could have the material but not the bomb. Or you could be working on the bomb design while you wait for the material.
Most experts believe Iran has already done a lot of the math and the design work over the last 2 decades. They are what we call a nuclear threshold state. They have the components, the knowledge, and the material. The pivot to 90% is the final physical threshold. Once they have that weapons-grade uranium, the weaponization, the actual assembly of the device, could potentially be finished in a few months, or even less if they have been running parallel secret programs for the non-nuclear components.
This brings us to Daniel's question about the latest possible moment for military action. How do you define that? Is it when the gas hits 90%, or is it before they even start that final pass?
That is the most intense debate in the security world right now. There is a concept called the zone of immunity. This is a term often used by Israeli officials. It refers to the point where Iran's nuclear program is so deeply buried and so advanced that a conventional military strike can no longer significantly delay it. If they move all their 60% material into the deep underground facility at Fordo, or the new site being dug near Natanz at Kue Kulangaz, they enter that zone.
I have read about that new site. It is supposed to be even deeper than Fordow, right? Like 80 to 100 meters underground.
Exactly. It is buried under a mountain of solid rock. At that depth, even the most powerful bunker busters in the U.S. arsenal, like the 30,000-pound GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator, might struggle to reach the centrifuge hulls. So the latest possible moment for action is not necessarily when they have a bomb. It is when we lose the physical ability to stop them from getting one.
So the decision point for a country like the United States or Israel is likely when they see the definitive move toward 90% enrichment combined with a total breakdown in diplomacy. But there is a catch, isn't there? If you wait until they have 90%, you might already be too late.
That is the nightmare. If they produce the 90% material, they could move it in a small suitcase to a secret location within hours. You cannot find 25 kilograms of uranium metal with a satellite once it has been moved into a basement in a crowded city. The window for effective military action is actually before the breakout is complete, specifically, the moment they begin reconfiguring the cascades for that final 90% run.
This brings up the role of seismic monitoring. I have read that the international community uses seismic sensors to listen for underground nuclear tests, but could they also be used to detect the construction of these new tunnels?
Centrifuges themselves do not create enough of a seismic footprint to be detected from a distance, but the construction of the facility certainly does. We saw this with the new tunnels near Natanz. The sheer volume of dirt being moved, which we can see from space, and the seismic signatures of the blasting, told us that they were building something much deeper and more protected than anything we had seen before. It is a race between the drill and the bomb.
It feels like a game of cat and mouse, where the mouse is building a much stronger hole every year. But let's go back to the intelligence community's confidence levels. When an agency says Iran is 2 weeks away from breakout, how much of that is a hard fact, and how much is a statistical model?
It is heavily modeled. They use something called separative work units, or SWUs. Think of an SWU as a measure of the effort required to enrich uranium. Intelligence agencies know the exact capacity of an IR-1 centrifuge versus an IR-6 or an IR-9. They have the specs. They know how many of each Iran has installed because they count them in the IAEA reports or via satellite.
So they run simulations.
Exactly. They run thousands of simulations. If Iran uses 2,000 IR-6s starting with a stockpile of 300 kilograms of 60% material, how many days until they have one significant quantity of 90%? The physics of the centrifuges is a known constant. The uncertainty comes from not knowing exactly how many machines are actually spinning at any given second, or if they have improved the efficiency of their rotors in secret.
And that is why the IAEA's loss of continuity of knowledge is so dangerous. If the cameras have been off or restricted for months, the intelligence community has to rely on more indirect methods to fill in the gaps. They are essentially trying to solve a puzzle where half the pieces are missing.
Right. They might look at the production of centrifuge rotors at secondary factories. If a factory is producing rotors at a certain rate, we can estimate how many new machines are being installed, but it is not perfect. There is always the risk of a strategic surprise. This is why the intelligence community looks for the political pivot point. The moment where the leadership in Tehran decides the cost of not having a bomb is higher than the cost of the sanctions and potential strikes.
What does that political pivot look like from an intelligence perspective? Is it a change in rhetoric from the supreme leader, or is it more subtle?
It is usually reflected in the security posture. If you see Iranian air defenses like their S-300 or S-400 systems around nuclear sites go to high alert, or if you see top nuclear scientists being moved to secure bunkers, those are indicators of a shift in intent. Also, signals intelligence intercepted communications between the Revolutionary Guard and the Atomic Energy Organization can provide the why behind the what. But the Iranians are masters of operational security. They know we are listening.
So, we have the technical indicators, the cascades, the pipes, the heat signatures. We have the military indicators, the air defenses, the movement of personnel. And then we have the weaponization indicators, the high explosive testing, and specialized electronics. When you put them all together, you get this dashboard of the breakout window.
Yes, and that dashboard is flashing yellow, bordering on red, right now in early 2026. The move from 60 to 90% is the final physical barrier. Once that is crossed, you are no longer in a breakout window, you are in a breakout reality. At that point, the military options change from prevention to damage control, which is a much more dangerous position to be in.
And that is why the timing of a strike is so critical. If a military strike happens while the material is still in gas form inside the centrifuges, you can destroy the machines and potentially contaminate the facility, setting the program back by years. But if the material has already been converted to a metal and moved, a strike on the facility might be a hollow victory.
That is the nightmare scenario for planners in the Pentagon or the Kiryat in Tel Aviv. The latest possible moment for decisive military action is generally considered to be before the conversion of weapons grade uranium gas into a solid metallic component. Once it is a solid, it is small, it is portable, and it is very easy to hide. You cannot find 25 kilograms of uranium metal with a satellite. It is about the size of a grapefruit.
So the intelligence community is essentially trying to predict a transition from a large visible industrial process to a small invisible manufacturing process.
That is a perfect way to put it, and that transition happens at the 90% mark. That is why 60% was such a huge deal when they first hit it. It was the last comfortable stopping point before the process becomes too fast to reliably track. At 60%, you are standing on the edge of the cliff. At 90%, you have already jumped.
It is interesting because this is not just about Iran. This is about the entire global non-proliferation regime. If the international community cannot accurately estimate or stop this, it sets a precedent for every other country with nuclear ambitions.
Absolutely. We have seen this movie before with North Korea. There were years of estimates and red lines, and then one day in 2006 they conducted a test, and the conversation changed overnight from how do we stop them to how do we live with them. The goal with Iran, for the US and Israel at least, is to prevent that shift from ever happening. But the window is getting incredibly tight.
Let's talk about the military side for a second. If you are a military planner, and you are told the breakout window is now down to 1 week, what does that do to your decision-making? Do you have to act on day 1? Or do you wait until day 6 to be absolutely sure?
Military planners hate uncertainty. They want to act when they have the highest probability of success with the lowest risk of retaliation. But in this case, the risk of waiting is total failure of the mission. Most military doctrine suggests that you act as soon as you have a definitive signature of intent to cross the final threshold. You do not wait for the 90% to be finished. You act when the cascades are being reconfigured for that final run.
But how do you verify that reconfiguration without being on the ground? We are back to the same problem of limited access.
It is a feedback loop. You use cyber tools. We saw this with Stuxnet years ago, which was a joint US-Israeli operation that used a worm to make Iranian centrifuges spin out of control and destroy themselves. Today, cyber intelligence is used to get internal data from the facility's control systems. If the software that controls the valves and the pressure in the cascades shows a change in the flow patterns, that is your smoking gun. Cyber intelligence provides the ground truth that satellites cannot see.
That is fascinating. So the sensors are not just outside the mountain, they are inside the computers that run the machines inside the mountain.
If you can get them in there, yes. But as we know, the Iranians have become much more sophisticated in their cyber defenses since the Stuxnet era. They have air-gapped their systems, meaning they aren't connected to the internet, and they have developed their own indigenous software. It is a constant arms race between their engineers and international intelligence agencies.
It feels like we are describing a high-stakes chess game where the board is hidden under a mountain and the players are using X-ray vision and hidden microphones to guess each other's moves.
And the clock is ticking faster every minute. The jump from 60 to 90% is the final sprint. For the intelligence community, identifying that pivot point is the difference between a successful intervention and a nuclear-armed Middle East.
It is a lot to take in. The complexity of the physics combined with the opacity of the regime makes for a very volatile situation. I think it is important for people to realize that when they hear these terms like breakout window on the news, there is this massive multi-layered intelligence operation behind those words. It is not just a political talking point.
Exactly. It is a technical calculation based on some of the most sophisticated surveillance and modeling in human history. And yet, even with all that, there is still a margin for error. And in the nuclear world, as Daniel mentioned, there is no margin for error. If you miss the window by 48 hours, the entire geopolitical landscape of the 21st century changes.
That is a sobering thought. I think we have covered the technical and intelligence aspects pretty well. It really highlights why the diplomacy is so frantic and why the military tension is so high. You are not just fighting over a policy. You are fighting over a timeline that is measured in days.
Well said. It is the physics that dictates the politics here, not the other way around. Once the centrifuges start spinning that 60% material into 90%, the laws of physics take over, and the time for talk effectively ends. The international community is essentially trying to outrun the laws of thermodynamics and nuclear engineering.
So, thinking about what we can actually take away from this, it seems like the most important thing for the public to understand is that the red line is not a single event, but a series of technical transitions.
Right. And the most dangerous transition is the one we are currently approaching in 2026. If you are a listener and you want to follow this, do not just look for news about a bomb test. By the time a test happens, it is over. Look for news about IAEA access, look for news about the size of the 60% stockpile, and look for news about the construction of deeper underground facilities. Those are the real indicators of where we are in the timeline.
And I think it is also worth noting that the intelligence community is not a monolith. Different agencies might have different confidence levels. The US might be more cautious, wanting to wait for absolute proof, while Israel might see the window as closing sooner based on their own risk tolerance. That friction is also part of the story.
Definitely. They are looking at the same data but through different lenses of risk. What is an acceptable risk for Washington might be an existential threat for Jerusalem. That is where the military decision-making gets really complicated. If Israel decides the window is closing and acts unilaterally, it pulls the rest of the world into the conflict regardless of their own assessments.
Well, this has been an intense dive, but a necessary one. Thanks for the breakdown, Herman. I think it really clarifies what is happening behind the headlines. It is not just about the what, it is about the when and the how.
My pleasure. It is a topic that deserves this kind of deep look, even if it is a bit rattling to think about how close the margins are.
Absolutely. And to our listeners, if you have been following along with us through these more technical episodes, we really appreciate your curiosity. This is why we do the show too, to get into the nuances that the quick news cycles often miss. We are living in a time where understanding the difference between 60% and 90% enrichment actually matters for understanding the evening news.
Yeah, and if you are finding these discussions valuable, we would love it if you could leave us a review on your podcast app or on Spotify. It really helps the show grow, and helps other people find these deep dives into the weird and complex prompts we get.
It really does make a difference. You can find us at myweirdprompts.com for all our past episodes and the RSS feed. We are on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and basically everywhere you get your audio.
And if you want to reach out, you can hit us up at show@myweirdprompts.com. We love hearing your thoughts, your follow-up questions, or even your own theories on how this all plays out.
Thanks again to Daniel for sending this in. It is a heavy one, but an important one for understanding the world right now in February of 2026.
Definitely. Until next time, this has been My Weird Prompts.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring Daniel Rosehill's AI prompts, as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters including me, Cornelius the Sloth. Subscribe on Spotify or visit myweirdprompts.com.